Good morning. I'm going to share a story with you that some of you have heard already. I used it as an illustration on Wednesday night for an invitation, just a 2 or 3 minute devotional talk. And after that, I thought to myself, that was a good illustration. I should have saved that for a sermon. So a couple of you will hear this story over again. Many of you were not there that night, and it's a funny story, so I think you'll enjoy it. But more importantly, I think it'll illustrate the lesson I want to get across to you this morning. When we think of sin, sometimes we think of the big sins, the ones that we try the hardest to avoid. And sometimes we measure our life or our success as a Christian by those big sins. Well, I don't abuse my children, I don't cheat on my wife, I don't steal, hundreds of thousands of dollars in an offshore account from my company, so I must be doing okay. But what if it's not those big sins? What if it's not those great sins that are the biggest threat or danger to your soul? What if it's the little ones? Maybe it's the sins that lie underneath, the ones that we consider in American culture to be normal or acceptable, the ones that go undetected. What if those are the sins that affect you and I the most? As an illustration, I've talked about my car before. It's a 1997 Honda Accord. This February will mark the 11-year anniversary of when I bought this car right before Jessica and I got married. And I've gotten every penny out of that purchase. And then some. I bought it 11 years ago with 150,000 miles. It now has 270,000 miles. And in the 11 years that I've owned it, part of that time I've not owned it. We've traded it back and forth with my in-laws several times. It was the first car that my little brother-in-law drove, up until the point he was rear-ended in a hit-and-run accident, which left the car totaled. Well, my father-in-law took the money on the insurance because the car was worthless, but they got money out of it. Rather than fix a worthless car, he kept the money and gave it back to me. I was in need of a car, and I was more than happy for nostalgia to get my old car back. Even though the bumper is barely hanging on and the trunk lid doesn't quite close all the way. Every year when it comes time for safety and emissions, it's kind of a cross your fingers, say a prayer, and hope for the best kind of scenario. The first year I got it to pass emissions, I had to replace the muffler and a couple of the lights. Apparently it's not safe to put red tape over a broken stoplight in the state of Utah. And so I had to fix some of those things in this last year. I loaned it out to somebody and got it back, and I knew the brakes were starting to go bad, but they were really bad when it came time to pass safety and emissions. And so I took it down to Jiffy Lube. I needed to get some other things addressed, the oil change, and I thought, well, they're trying to get it to pass safety and emissions. Why don't you just take a look at the brakes? And they said, well, actually, I don't see a problem here. Just a little bit of rust on there. It makes this horrible screeching noise every time you hit the brakes. And even when you're not pushing the brakes, you hear this horrible sound. But the guy who was in charge of safety and emissions said, oh, it's fine. I'm not going to fail you for that. In fact, why don't you just take it down a canyon road and ride the brakes really hard, and that'll burn off some of the rust. And I thought, I'd rather live. Since I needed this car to work, I moved over the summertime. I still can't find all my tools. Brake stuff I do myself, but I needed it fixed right then and there. So I took it down to Les Schwab, and they know a little bit more about brakes. And they said, yeah, you need to replace these. The rotors, the disc, the pads, the calipers, flush all the fluids out. And so a couple $100 later, the car got passed. And so I get it for at least another year, assuming it runs for another year. That's a year of no car payments, so I'm happy about that. But the point that I'm getting at is every year, the one thing I know they're always going to ask me about is the washer fluid on the windshield wipers. They're going to come to me and say, well, here's where it fails, this, and the washer fluid doesn't work. I say, yes, it does. You have to pull it in and push down really hard, and then the fluid will pop out. And I have to show them, and they say, okay, it does work. And so after going through all this process of getting it to pass safety and emissions, spending a couple $100, fix the brakes, and get it to where I feel safe driving in it, I pull out of the driveway, and I go to turn the wipers on, and you pull in and push down really hard, and snap. And now I can fix this. It's like $80 for the part to fix this, but the funny thing was, after all that I went through to get my car functional, the little stick with the controller for the windshield wipers broke. And that tiny little thing is why the car is basically worthless when it rains. It's that tiny little problem that has been the biggest problem I've had with this car since I've owned it. Sometimes it's those little problems that we don't even really think about that can have the greatest impact on the way we function. And maybe that's true with sin. So this morning I want to talk about 6. Now there's a lot more that could be added to this list, but I'd like to talk about 6. We're going to begin with fear. Fear is one of those sins that I think a lot of Christians are okay with. We don't really think of it as a sin the same way as like cheating on your wife or stealing money from somebody. We don't really put it in the same category. Well, there's sin with a capital S, and there's sin over here, little s. And I think sometimes we put fear there. But when you think about it, this phrase, do not fear or do not be afraid, or if you're in the King James, be ye not afraid or something like that. It's in the Bible over 300 times, nearly 400 times, depending on which translation you're looking at. Now, of all those nearly 400 times, they aren't always addressed to us, but you start to get the impression that for those who follow God, his advice to them constantly is, don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. And sometimes it is directed right at us. I'm going to skip 1 John 4 for just a minute, so don't read that. I'm going to go on to these next 2 scriptures first and then come back. In Matthew chapter 10, we know that Jesus himself basically says, don't worry about anything. Don't worry about it. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 26, he tries to remind us, and his disciples specifically here, but an application for us as well, to keep a healthy perspective on fear. Fear is okay. Fear in its proper amount is all right. We need to be afraid of cars, otherwise you walk in the middle of the street and get run over. We need to have a healthy respect for things that can hurt us. But then there's crossing a line into fear, where we let fear dictate our actions, where fear grips us, where fear twists us. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 26. Therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. What you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent, and yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Therefore do not fear. You are of more value than many sparrows. He's sending his disciples out to go and preach, and they might face some dangers. He says, don't be afraid. Well, don't they have a legitimate cause to be afraid? Well, Jesus says, no. Keep the right perspective. They can only harm your body. They can only take away your life. That's really nothing in the grand scheme of eternity. And similarly, when we look to what's said to those disciples in Revelation chapter 2, as we look at the church in Smyrna, he says to them very plainly, very matter-of-factly in verse 10, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, 10 days, you could read that literally, but I don't know, I'm inclined to take Revelation more figuratively. When I think of 10 as a complete number, I say he's probably telling them you're going to experience suffering and tribulation for the rest of your time on earth. It might mean 10 literal days, I doubt it. But they're going to face something really difficult. And you know what he says? Satan is going to throw you into prison. You're going to be tested. You're going to have tribulation. But don't be afraid. How do we do that? How do we not be afraid? We need to keep the eternal perspective. And so we think of all the times that God tells us, all the times that Jesus says, do not be afraid, do not have fear. He means it. Because we need to have faith in him. We need to have trust in him. And we need to really believe it that when he says, the end of the road, the end of this life, there awaits something far greater. We need to believe him when he says that. So that's why he tells us, don't be afraid. So this is one of those things that, in spite of the fact that God tells us hundreds of times in the Bible, directly and indirectly, don't be afraid because you should trust in me, we still do it. Yet I want to go to 1 John chapter 4. I wanted to save that for last. I put it out of order, but because I think you and I think a lot of Christians, we get, Matthew chapter 10, we get Revelation chapter 2. I think we get that a little bit better than what we read in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 18. 1 John chapter 4, and verse 18. It says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love." We might overcome our fears of the world. We might not be afraid of what the people out there might do to us. We're not afraid of persecution. We might get to that level, yet I think there's a lot of Christians that still carry fear with them of a different kind. This fear that I'm not good enough. This fear that I have not perfected myself well enough, that I have not become obedient enough to God to be worthy. There is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. Fear has to do with punishment. Whoever has fears has not been perfected in love. Maybe we carry around a different kind of fear with us. Go back a verse. 1 John 4 and verse 17. It explains this a little bit better. How do we have this perfect love? And by this, love is perfected with us, that we may have confidence in the day of judgment. Because as he is, so also we are in this world. And you can even tie this into chapter 2 and verse 28. "And now, little children, abide in him, so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not shrink away from him in shame at his coming. If you know that he is righteous, you know that everyone also who practices righteousness is born of him." That's what that perfected love is. When we understand, I'm righteous, and I wasn't here, but I'm glad we recorded Art's lesson last Sunday night. Sometimes we're too afraid to say I'm righteous. It's not about what I've done necessarily. It's not because I've made myself righteous. I'm righteous because of the blood of the Lamb. Sometimes we're a little bit too afraid to say that, to say, yes, I am righteous. Thank you, God. Thanks be to the Son of God who died for me that I can be righteous. And now we pursue the same type of life that he lived. That's the perfected love. That when we love others the way Jesus loved us, and when we show that love and live that love, because as he is, so also are we in this world. We abide in him, we pursue righteousness, and we pursue the same kind of love with which Jesus loved us. And that's the kind of love that casts out fear. We don't cower in shame. We don't, as it says in verse 22, we don't shrink away in shame from his coming. And in verse 17, we have confidence in the day of judgment. Fear is something we shouldn't carry with us. Now, yes, fear God, that is the beginning of all wisdom. There's room for a healthy respect, that kind of fear. When I was a child, I feared my dad because he would spank me when I was bad. I'm not afraid of that now. I think I could take my dad. But I fear him in another way. I fear losing his respect. I fear disappointing him. It's not a fear of punishment. I'm not afraid of him anymore per se, but my fear as a child has grown into love, admiration, and respect. And that's this perfected love here. So let's not carry fear around with us. That's something the world says it's okay to be afraid of all kinds of things, but for the Christian it's not. Do not be afraid is what God tells us every page of this book. Secondly, another one of those little sins is apathy. Now, we define apathy. We go to Webster's. It says a lack of emotion. I don't care. I have no feelings. A lack of interest. Listless condition or indifference. And other synonyms you might put in the place are impassive, indifferent, lethargic, unconcerned. Now, here's the real danger, if we want to label this as a sin, and why it's so subtle, why it's such a danger to us, and why we don't usually acknowledge it as a sin, is because apathy is doing nothing. It's not like I'm doing anything wrong. And so we don't think of it as being necessarily sinful, because, sin is when you break a commandment of God, right? Sin is when God says, thou shalt not, and you do it anyway. Well, yes, sin is that, but sin is also when God tells you to do something, and you sit on the sideline and don't. That's why apathy is so dangerous. Apathy can destroy a church. In Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 18, we understand this when it comes to physical things. Many of you know my frustrations and struggles with my last house. Not the one I'm in now, but the yard. I just never quite had the budget or time to rebuild the yard from the ground up. What frustrates me about that is there was a sprinkler system in there There was once grass in that yard. It was once well maintained. All the corners were edged and trimmed, and there was grass and there was a sprinkler system. But by the time I got the house, well, it wasn't a good sprinkler system. It was only 4 inches buried below the ground. I just pulled it up with my arms. But it once was a green lawn with a functioning sprinkler system. But by the time I got it, it was choked out with weeds and nothing I could salvage in that yard. It got that way because somebody just forgot and let go of the daily maintenance. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. To destroy a house, you don't need to burn it down. You don't need to set it aflame with fire. You don't need to target the main support pillars with a sledgehammer. I mean, that all works, but you don't need to do those things to tear a house down. You just need to do nothing, and it'll fall apart on its own eventually. We understand this in physical terms, and in this physical illustration, the same is true. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I want you to turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and think about relating it to our text in Ecclesiastes there. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we think about what this church is. I'm not talking about this building here. What we are as the people of God, the church. What do we represent? A spiritual building. The same principle from Ecclesiastes applies here. 1 Corinthians 3, starting in verse 16. We're going to read verse 16 and 17 here. Do you not know that you are a temple of God, that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. In a sense, that's you and I individually. We each have the presence of God dwelling in us as a temple, but collectively as a church. We are stones built into a holy building. We are living stones that make up the temple of God. When we are apathetic to the upkeep of this supremely important spiritual building, the same thing happens. It falls apart. When things are left undone, when people who need to be encouraged fall through the cracks, when classes are not well attended, when people, I know there's work, I know there's sickness, those are good reasons to not be here. Don't come if you're sick, I understand that, but when classrooms are empty simply because people don't want to be there. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. Apathy is a killer. Might not be that you're doing anything wrong, but if you're not doing the right things, it's just as dangerous, just as deadly spiritually. Thirdly, am I allowed to talk about this one? I feel like this is one of those elephants in the room, that we know it's in the Bible, we know gluttony is wrong, but we're just not allowed to talk about it though, right? Hey, to my defense, I waited till after Thanksgiving, after Christmas, after New Year's, before I got to it. But am I right? This is something that's very plainly taught in the Bible, that excess and gluttony is wrong, yet it's one of those things that we just kind of, chuckle at, like, yeah, I know I probably shouldn't, but in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 18, it is good and fitting for one to eat and drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun. That's repeated 3 or 4 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, that basic phrase. In the Garden of Eden, one of the punishments for mankind when we were kicked out of the garden was you have to work, labor, and toil by the sweat of your brow to put food on your table. And so, I'm not condemning eating a big meal now and then, because the Bible tells us that can be a good thing. When labor results in food for the body, there's no sin in partaking of it with joy. And I think of the prodigal son. You could say the prodigal son wasted his money by being gluttonous, self-indulgent. Yet when he returned to his father, he said, let's kill the fattened calf and have a party. It's okay to celebrate. It's okay to have a big meal in celebration sometimes, but when we make this our lifestyle, that's, I think, when we're crossing a line. That's when we're getting into dangerous territory. And the Bible does have plenty to say about it. And even in the New Testament, it says the Cretans were lazy gluttons. It's associated with laziness and consumption, especially when you're eating, but you're not working to earn it. You're not willing to get out and work and put food on the table, but you're always willing to consume and eat. There's a lot of that going on in this country. And Proverbs 22 and verse 21 is associated with drunkenness. It brings on drowsiness and it brings on poverty. And so certainly condemned in the Bible, but I don't want to limit this just to food. Because really it's a condition of the heart that I want to, if you eat too much food, you will get a heart condition, but I mean spiritually, it's a condition of the heart. This is what matters most. God created within each and every one of us an emptiness, a void, a longing for something spiritual. It says he put eternity in the heart of man. And I think people try to fill that spiritual longing with physical things. We eat food. We fill our stomachs with food. We fill our houses with trinkets and toys and gadgets and stuff that we don't even use or need. Because we're trying to find contentment and joy aside from God. I'm not saying it's wrong to indulge now and then, but I'm saying when this becomes our lifestyle, when we start to take our focus off of Jesus and our focus onto this world. And that's exactly what Paul warned the Philippians. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 18. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. Have you set your mind on earthly things? That's the beginning of gluttony. Gluttony is searching for contentment aside from God, yet the glutton will never find satisfaction. There are so many people, so many different kinds of eating disorders, always trying to be filled, but they're always eating more. And it's the same thing when it comes to the gathering up of possessions, when it comes to buying things that you just don't need. We should remember the warnings of the book of Proverbs. Have you found honey? Eat only as much as you need, lest you be filled with it and vomit. Or the warnings from Paul, the things that he taught the Christians in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 8, there on the screen. Having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. That's a hard-learned lesson, but it's one that we need to learn. Let's not complain. Let's not grumble. Let's not be frustrated at all the things we don't have. Let's be thankful. Because if you live in this country, you are rich. Fourthly, another thing that Jesus had to talk about was worry. It's like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you anywhere. And Jesus spoke about this in the Sermon on the Mount. This is another one of those kind of like, don't be afraid. What do you mean I can't be afraid? Well, don't worry either. In Matthew chapter 6, we could read a whole lot about this there in Matthew chapter 6. In verse 25, for this reason I say to you, do not be anxious for your life as to what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor for your body as to what you shall put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? He talks about the birds, how they don't worry about it, but they have food to eat. He talks about the lilies, how beautiful they are, and they don't worry about how they look. Verse 30, but if God so arrays the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown in the furnace, will he not much more do so for you, O men of little faith? Do not be anxious then, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or with what shall we clothe ourselves? For all these things the Gentiles eagerly seek, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Therefore do not be anxious for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And that sounds like a pretty direct command from God, does it not? Be not anxious. Don't worry. Kind of like with fear, there's room for a healthy respect of things that can hurt you. There's room to have concern. This isn't saying don't start a 401k because you don't need to be worried about tomorrow. You can be concerned about the future, about planning for your kids' college, budgeting to retire at a certain age. That's okay to have a concern, but don't be consumed. That's what he says, don't worry, don't be anxious. And there's a phrase that stuck with me. Many of you could probably remember a sermon or two that has deeply impacted your life, that You know, I'm sure, I'd like to think you remember every one of my sermons. I don't even remember every one of my sermons, but every now and then you hear a sermon that is something you needed to hear at the right time, and it sticks with you, and it shapes and changes the direction of your life. I heard one of those sermons when I was a young teenager. Guy Roberson was preaching, and the sermon was, I think, on 1 Peter chapter 5, in verse 7, be anxious for nothing. And the whole summary of the sermon, I can't remember much else about it, but what has stuck with me is this phrase, worry about nothing and pray about everything. Why does God tell us to pray? He's right here, we read in Matthew chapter 6, God says, I already know what you need before you ask me, so why do we need to ask him? Is it for his benefit? Do you think prayer helps us a little bit too? At the heart of this is a lack of faith. And that's why he said in Matthew 6, oh, ye of little faith. Why is it important that we don't worry about these things? Because we have faith in God. So let's understand, that's one of those subtle sins that a lot of people are okay with, that a lot of people don't really think is a problem in their life. Flattery. Number 5, and we got 2 more to go. Flattery. And you might think, what's wrong with flattery? I like compliments. Well, there's a difference between complimenting somebody and flattery. Flattery is puffing up. Flattery is, it doesn't really have substance to it necessarily. In Proverbs chapter 26 and verse 28, it says, a flattering mouth works ruin or destruction. And I've got it here on the board. Proverbs 28 and verse 23, whoever rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with his tongue. What I'm talking about is like, on American Idol, we always love the early stages when they've got the people that don't know what they're doing. They have the most terrible voice. They have the weirdest choice of wardrobe. And they're just the most bizarre thing you've ever seen in the world. We know those people. And you just feel sorry for them. They're embarrassing themselves, probably because someone earlier in their life just didn't have the courage to tell them, you aren't that great at singing. They probably flattered them instead and said, you're going to be a superstar. They just didn't have the heart to tell them. And so they flattered him and built him up on this pedestal, and they don't really understand the truth, that they aren't going to be the next platinum record-selling artist. That's what it means by flattering. Oftentimes we flatter because we're too afraid to rebuke. We're too afraid to correct. And so that's something God commands of us in the Bible is to correct others. The real friend is not the flatterer, but the one who rebukes in the spirit of love. And here's what I mean. Rebuking, although admittedly, certainly it's not fun. And I understand why people shy away from doing it. But it's commanded of us nonetheless. In the Old Testament, I like what it says, Leviticus 19 and verse 17. Even in the Old Law, I just love how it's worded here. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Leviticus 19 and verse 17. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. No flattering there. You know what happens when you flatter somebody? If they've done something wrong, if they've offended you, yet you don't tell them about it, it says don't hate your brother in your heart. When you flatter, when you puff up, when you shy away from correcting it or confronting a sin, you just build up hatred in your heart. And you become companion to it, lest you incur sin because of him. That's why God is telling the nation of Israel, just speak frankly with your neighbor. If they've done something wrong, tell them kindly, in a spirit of love, of course. But don't just flatter them. Don't just avoid rebuke or correction. And Jesus tells us on a number of occasions, Matthew chapter 18, if your brother sins, go to him privately. Don't embarrass him, but go to him privately so there's no misunderstandings, and air it out. Don't leave it buried under the surface. Don't let hate simmer in your heart. Deal with it. Bring it out to the open and get it behind you. And Luke chapter 17 and verse 3 says, if your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, then you forgive him. Such a simple command, yet so difficult to do sometimes, is it not? So let's not flatter people. Let's not avoid confrontation and simply flatter people. That's one of those sins that we don't really think about as sinful. But the Bible says it is. And I got one more this morning. And again, there's probably lots more we could add to this list. There's lots of sins that we don't think about as being that bad. But a sin is a sin is a sin. No matter how great or small the consequences are, a sin is still sinful in the eyes of God. Lying. Titus chapter 1 and verse 2 says, God cannot lie. It's not in his nature, so it shouldn't be in our nature. And time again, the Bible says that in the Ten Commandments, to the law given to the nation of Israel, do not lie to one another. Proverbs 6 tells us that it's one of the things that God hates. He hates it. So we shouldn't do it, obviously. Immoral men, homosexuals, kidnappers, liars, and perjurers. It's in bad company. And Revelation 21 and verse 8. Along with the cowardly. Again, that's one that was kind of an almost ran and almost made it to this sermon, was cowardice. We don't think about that as being sinful, yet Revelation 21 verse 8 says, well, for those who lie and those who are cowards, their part is in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. It reveals God's feelings about lying and deception. There's a song that goes with Revelation 21 verse 8. Some of you went to summer camp might know it. Ask me afterwards about that. But I want to finish with Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. I want to finish in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus confronts the Pharisees about oaths, and we don't really always understand what oaths mean. We think about, a celebrity on trial, they're under oath. I always thought that was kind of funny, like, okay, well now you're going to tell the truth because you're under oath. Like that makes some big difference. Well, I have to tell the truth, I'm under oath. Well, I always thought that was just really silly, but Jesus isn't so much concerned with oaths as he is integrity. That's what he's dealing with in this section here. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 33, Jesus is simply talking about integrity. Again, you've heard it said that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all. Either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. And anything beyond this is of evil. You should live with such an integrity that your words don't need to be modified. They don't need to be qualified with a statement. And so typical, we say things like, I promise, I swear on my mother's grave, I swear on a stack of Bibles. It's such a subtle little thing. We even have the phrase, little white lie. If you lie in court, well, that's definitely bad. But if you just lie to make yourself look good, maybe, make a story sound more exciting, a fishing story or something like that. If you lie to make yourself good, if you lie to make yourself, keep yourself out of trouble, if you lie to get ahead of the next guy at work, those aren't so bad. Well, yes, they are. Lying, Jesus says, just let your yes be yes, let your no be no. None of this I promise, none of this I swear, and it happens so easily. The other day, Jessica had been asking me for weeks to hang up a couple of paintings in our bedroom, and I kept saying, I'll do it today, and I didn't, I'll do it today, I didn't, and finally she got really fed up with me and said, okay, they'll be up on the wall by the time you get back from work, or I will shave my beard off. She was merciful to me. She did give me a list of 20 things I had to do, though, to make up for the fact that I didn't keep my word, but we do it so subtly. Say, I promise I'll do this. Well, rather than saying what you're going to do, why don't you just do it? The things you need to do, why don't you just do them rather than talking about it? And when you say you're going to do something, you really should do it. We think about these as such little things. Little lies don't count. Well, yes, they do. Jesus wants us to be people of integrity, and he wants us to know our words matter. Jesus would later go on to say that every idle word we will give an account for. Think about the things you say and mean what you say and do what you say. So I think sometimes the undetected sins, the lowercase s sins, are the ones that we're in the greatest danger of, that are the greatest danger to our soul. They're the most toxic to us because we don't think of them as being overly sinful. There is no such thing as being overly sinful. Sin is sin, is sin, is sin in the eyes of God. The small sins that aren't that bad are the ones that get us. It's the little things. My hope is that you will see this lesson as an opportunity to grow, as a challenge to confront every sin in your life, whether it's perceived as great or small. And if there's any way we can help you confront your sins, we invite you to come forward and make that need known as we stand and sing.